afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us in today's webinar on the best practices for writing and disseminating plain language summaries of publications. I'm really excited to see so many of you joining today. And we want to interact with you in today's session. We want to hear your experiences, your comments, thoughts on what we share today, as well as your questions. So please use the chat box on the left, on the right of your screen to share your comments with us. And we'll do our best to answer your questions towards the end of this webinar. I also request you to please complete the brief feedback form that will pop up on your screen at the end of the webinar, which will help us to plan future webinars. I want to now introduce our panelists for today's session. Along with me, I have Stephanie Dooley, Joanne Walker, and Vicky Mooney. Stephanie Dooley is Director of Publication Specialist at Pfizer. In over 19 years of experience, diverse experience in medical affairs and medical communication. In her current role, Stephanie is responsible for development and implementation of product publication plans, and she ensures compliance to good publication practices and company policies. Joe Walker is co-founder and publishing director at Bucharest Publishing. She has over 20 years of experience with various journals and digital platforms. As head of publication solution at Future Science Group, she spearheaded the PLSP initiative. And now at Bucharest, her aim is to ensure that all information available at the Journal of Comparative Effectiveness Research and the evidence-based website is accessible, understandable, and engaging. And Vicky is a patient advocate, patient speaker, and executive director of European Coalition of People Living with Obesity, and chairperson of board for the Irish Coalition for People Living with Obesity. Vicky has also recently been involved in co-authoring a PLSP related to perceptions of obesity in teenagers. And I head the plain language services at Christelis, and in my career of over 12 years, I've worked with various sponsors and helped them in their plain language communication across domains, including PLSPs. And I will share the writer experience and insights in today's discussion. So welcome to all the panelists. For those of you who are new to PLSPs, these are summaries of scientific articles and Congress abstracts written in easy to understand non-technical language. And as part of GPP 2022 update, there's an encouragement that all manuscripts should have a plain language summary. Today's discussion is focused towards writing PLSPs for patients and the public. We also want to acknowledge that sometimes the target audience for these documents can be different, for example, healthcare professionals or non-specialist researchers. And for them, the approach readability would be different from what we'll discuss today. So we recognize that there may be other formats, but today's discussion is focused towards PLSPs for patients in public. There are many benefits of writing PLSPs. The very first one is it helps to bring the latest scientific research to community beyond the scientific researchers, and helps to build the information gap that exists right now within patients and public communities. It promotes diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, and provides quick snapshot for healthcare professionals to decide which topics they want to dive deeper when they are reviewing scientific research. And another important aspect is that it helps to facilitate discussion between healthcare professionals, patients, and caregivers. Today's discussion, we will have among three main themes. The very first one is planning and process. Under this theme, we'll talk about the different PLSP formats that are required or accepted by journals and other considerations involved in developing a plain language summary of publication. Under development, we'll talk about best practices for writing the content as well as the design. And lastly, we'll talk about best practices for disseminating and maximizing discoverability of PLSPs. So without further ado, let's talk about planning and process. And in first topic that we want to tackle is different formats of PLSP. And for that, I'll invite Jo to share her perspective on what formats are accepted with different journals. So over to you, Jo.
Thanks, Vidhi, and for asking me to take part in this webinar. Yeah, so I'm just going to provide a sort of a quick overview of the different types of PLS format that are available to accompany sort of manuscripts and scientific abstracts as well. So there's, as we see it, there's sort of three different types that can be presented alongside a manuscript. So the first is perhaps one that most people are familiar with, which is the sort of short, sort of 250 word abstract. We then talk about the supplementary plain language summary that can then be published alongside a manuscript, and then also the sort of newly formed standalone PLSP that is now published by several publishers, which includes Future Science Group, Becaris Publishing, and then soon to be Taylor and Francis and Sage as well. Next slide, please. So the sort of 250 word the PLS abstract, sort of plain language summary abstract. So these are perhaps the more common sort of form of PLS that are now being embraced by some, but not all publishers, unfortunately. So there's two different types of the sort of the PLS abstract. And both are absolutely correct and fine, but the structured abstract, which can be featured by many journals, that has just a bit more, as it says, a structure to it. It gives sort of specific headings to help the sort of reader navigate the content. And again, it's thinking about how your target reader might want to sort of read the information. And then the unstructured abstract, which is absolutely fine, but just sort of condenses all that information. And I think the different types really depends on the journal or how the conference organizer sort of publishes their plain language, the PLS abstract, and that's something to consider when looking at journals to publish. I mean, at Becaris Publishing, and I know a few other journals as well, we sort of follow the structured format because we sort of recognise that those are more easily to understand. But both are fine. And, as long as they're succinct and accurately represent the manuscript, that's absolutely fine. Next slide, please. So the second type, which is a bit more, which allows a bit more flexibility in terms of the structure of the PLS. So these are the sort of PLS that are published as supplementary materials alongside the original manuscript. So these can be a little bit more in-depth. They're sort of peer-reviewed, as with other PLS, alongside the article. And they can be considered any format. So you can have a text, a more structured sort of infographic style PLS, or you could even have a podcast with the author discussing the article in plain language, or again, it could be a video as well. And with some publishers, for instance, Future Science Group and also Becaris, we can actually publish these post-publications. So you can publish the original manuscript, and then perhaps a couple of months afterwards, when you consider that a PLS accompanying the manuscript might be suitable, that can be published as well following peer review. So next slide, please. So then the third type of PLS, which is something that is sort of quite new, as newly sort of published, which is something that I helped develop when I was at Future Science Group. So these are the standalone PLSPs, or plain language summary of publications. So these are standalone peer-reviewed articles in a journal. So they are published as an independent article, and they are assigned a DOI so that they are citable and discoverable and published like any other journal article. So they're then indexed on PubMed, Medline, etc., which sort of helps with their discoverability. So these articles provide a sort of more a longer form infographic style summary of a previously published article. And they're usually used when that original journal in which the article is published, from some of the more larger top tier journals. I won't name any names, but some of the larger top tier journals that don't allow PLS to be published, these standalone PLSPs can be used to publish a PLS, in one of the sort of Future Science Group or Becaris publishing journals, and they're fully compliant with the ICMJE guidelines. They're an acceptable secondary publication, and they just really help provide a sort of platform to just help present a bit more complex information in a sort of easier to understand format. Thanks, Vidhi.
Thank you, Joe, for sharing a bit more detail and helping us understand the different formats available. Now, let's switch gears and bring in the sponsor voice in the planning and process of it. So, for that, I invite Stephanie to share her experience.
Thanks, Vidhi, and thank you so much for including me in this very important webinar. I'm going to talk about a little bit of planning and development and kind of where you start with PLS. PLSP planning, we know, is very important and must be considered before you actually kind of dive into the development of a PLS. So the review and approval is an important first step to kind of decide what your process is going to be initially. At Pfizer, just to go back a few years, at Pfizer, my colleagues on the oncology team developed an abstract PLS pilot, and this was back in 2018. And this pilot lasted approximately 18 months, and it was a huge success. There were 185 abstract PLS developed during the pilot. The team, once the pilot was finished, the team incorporated the learnings from the pilot and developed a PLS best practices guidance document, which we still use today. The guidance document includes standards for appropriate language inclusion, for example, also appropriate reading levels for PLS, and also includes our kind of Pfizer overall process and review and approval for PLS. Prior to initiating a PLS, it would also be helpful to research, as Joe stated earlier, researching the journals that accept PLS. We know, unfortunately, not all journals accept PLS at this point. Hopefully that'll start to grow as PLS become more common. And once a journal is selected, you should look into what the requirements are for the PLS submissions at that journal. Also, you may want to consider, which we encourage at Pfizer, is the inclusion of patient reviewers. Patient reviewers can add value to the PLS in many ways by providing the patient perspective and also add patient insight into the readability. So how does the PLS read? Is it easy enough? And that sort of thing. And I also wanted to mention, I talked about not all journals accept PLS, and unfortunately we're working through that process. But if there are other options, such as Joe mentioned, the Future Science Group accepts standalone PLS that have the original manuscript published in another journal, and also Baccaris Publishing. And at Pfizer, we actually have our own Figshare site, and we do house PLS. We publish them on the Figshare site, and we have links that go back to the original manuscript within those PLS that are published there. And so that comes in handy as an option when the original journal does not accept PLS. Next slide, please, Vidhi. So this slide just kind of gives an overview of the types of publications and considerations for when a PLS should be considered. Although it may be useful to have an accompanying PLS for every publication. I mean, we would love to do that. Unfortunately, it's most likely not feasible due to in-house and external resourcing and also budget. A recommendation would be to develop objective criteria, if possible, to select publications for which you should develop a PLS. For example, a phase 3 clinical study may be more applicable to a general audience, versus a phase 1 PK study. So ultimately, publications that have information that's relevant and applicable to a lay audience, which may include disease state information or treatment information or data, on a drug. And these type of data can impact patient lives. Ultimately, they could all benefit from a PLS. I think we can move on to the next slide, Vidhi, please. So I kind of talked about the process overview. It is important to consider including early on your PLS into your publication plan for the product or disease state. And also factor in the timelines, because it does take time to develop the PLS. So we need to take that all into consideration, and also consider who's going to be writing your PLS. Is that going to be your external publication vendor, or do you have resources in-house to write your PLSP? And at Pfizer, we don't start developing our PLS until the original article is very close to being published or is actually published. And the reason for that is the PLS has to be consistent with the published manuscript itself. So we can't go off topic. It has to be very close and in line with what's been published in the original article. You also have to take into consideration, your review and approval process. Who's going to take a look at your PLS in-house? In addition to your authors that are authoring the PLS, you have to take into consideration how long that's going to take, and who's going to review internally. Will that be medical affairs, your clinical team? At Pfizer, my team, the pub management team, always reviews the PLS prior to submission. And it also, I just wanted to add here too, and it might be helpful to develop, we have at Pfizer a checklist, which includes kind of all of our requirements for PLS. So, what should be included within the PLS, the types of disclosures that should be included. We have a checklist that kind of goes over all of that. And we always review that before submission to the journal. Next slide, please, Vidhi.
Great, thanks, Stephanie, for adding those perspectives around planning and how to decide which manuscript should have a PLSP, and then how to incorporate it in the publication process. Stephanie already introduced the concept of involving patients in the PLSP process, and let's take a moment to talk in a bit more detail about it. As Stephanie already mentioned, that unless you involve patients in the process, we as writers, researchers, clinicians, statisticians are only assuming what matters to patients and what's understandable. So it's absolutely critical that the involvement is there, so that we can create these documents that make sense and that are effective for our audience. There are two main types of involvement that we want to talk about today. One is of a patient reviewer, where they are involved in reviewing a draft PLSP and providing feedback during the development process, which can help us to find the gaps in the document and make it more clear and readable for our audience. For this type of role, a background or basic understanding of clinical research principles may not be necessary. And in fact, it helps when the background knowledge is not there, because then we are able to see the document from a fresh perspective of our target audience, for whom this topic is absolutely new. And taking all of these factors in consideration, it's definitely easier and quicker to involve patient reviewers in the process compared to patient author role, which is a bit more involved, requiring co-authoring of a PLSP along with other stakeholders involved in the process. From our perspective, having basic understanding of clinical research principles is critical, and also training on the process and roles and responsibilities of different stakeholders are quite important. So, really thinking through with patient involvement in the PLSP process, being clear of what the end goal you want to achieve, and identifying what type of involvement works for you is the key to do it effectively. I want to take this moment to also hear from Vicky her experience of recently co-authoring a PLSP. So, Vicky, if you could share with our audience more on that.
No problem at all, Vidhi. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be here with Joe and Stephanie and yourself. I think when I was first approached to actually do a PLS, it was quite intimidating. And as you rightly say, when it comes to the clinical research principles, it's something that I hadn't wrapped my head around before. However, there is something very valuable in the fresh eyes of a patient unpacking the original article and abstract and so on and so forth. I think when you're going into this, never assume that your patient understands the process. Start at the very beginning and bring them in at the very beginning. You having their training and support is important, but as soon as you involve them, that is best. The earlier, the better, because when it comes to the original article, for them to actually, take that in and ensure they feel they're in a safe space, there's no silly questions, for them to be able to review or become a patient order, it's really imperative that they realize the importance of their piece in this. And I think as well, we look at so many different disease areas as well. I don't know one that hasn't got a patient advocacy group to reach out to. So I think if you're starting out on this, we seen it as a bit of a test when it came to action teams and future science, and it was probably the most downloaded piece that we had. So it was quite an enjoyable experience, but start early, start very, very early.
Great advice, and thanks for sharing the importance of training and support needed to make this work well. Just wanting to ask Stephanie as well, if you can share a bit more detail on how patient involvement works at Pfizer.
Yeah, so we have a few manuscripts that have actually included patient authors as well. So this isn't specific to PLS, but in the involvement in general of patient authors is very encouraged here at Pfizer. And we want to put forth that patient voice into publications in general. So as we do more PLS, we hope to include more patient authorship. And then, I already mentioned that we do have patient reviewers that look at some of our PLS, and we hope to expand that more so that all PLS get reviewed by patients before they get published, because it's very important to get we can do as many PLS as possible, but if they're not impacting patient lives and make sense to that audience, then what is the benefit? So we really encourage patients to be involved in all levels.
Absolutely. And thanks for sharing. Great to hear both involvement as patient reviewers and authors. So Joe, I want to turn to you. We know that even publishers involve patient reviewers in the editorial review process. So can you share your perspective as well?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. So for the standalone PLSPs, which is published as a standalone journal article, so they undergo extensive peer review, but rather than sort of peer review by the HCPs, researchers that happens with a normal journal article, the peer review process for PLSPs is slightly different, and we do ask patients as well as plain language experts. And many patients are now becoming plain language experts, and we ask them to peer review the content. They're not looking at whether the methodology of the study, whether the data crunching. They're actually just looking at the whole picture of the article, whether it's understandable, whether it accurately reflects the original article, and whether it sort of follows plain language principles. So they're a really important part of the publication process for the standalone PLSPs, and as part of that as well, sort of we recognise their importance, and we then sort of, which I know is quite a sort of it's a little slightly controversial subject, but we do actually pay these patient reviewers for their time as well, because we pay them fair market value, because we just wish it that it's not that reviewing a PLS is something that they do for themselves. So we feel it's fair that they are recognised for that as well. And also, as Stephanie's mentioned as well, and as Vicky knows as well, we also do encourage patients to be added on the author sort of byline for PLSPs, as long as they fulfil all the ICMJE criteria for sort of the part of contributing to the PLSP. Then that we're happy to accept them as well.
That's great to hear. Thanks for sharing. And now we'll switch gears and move to development theme, wherein we'll talk about best practices for the content and design of a PLSP. For PLSP content, there are a few main factors that we want to recognize here. The content is determined by, of course, the manuscript content or the research content based on which the PLSP is being written. Next, most important aspect is the target journal and whether that target journal accepts a PLSP and in which formats. The third important factor is the budget involved, as Stephanie also mentioned earlier, that the effort involved in creating different versions or different formats of PLSP varies drastically because of the amount of content and involvement required. And once the format has been agreed based on what's possible and what the budget allows, that would impact how much content to go in. So a useful tip here is that if you are aiming to write a PLSP abstract, start with the scientific abstract as your source material and convert that into plain language. And when you are doing an editorial review of that PLSP abstract, you may be able to see some gaps in the content, for example, things that doesn't necessarily provide background information on why certain disease endpoints are being measured. In that case, we recommend that go to the manuscript and find for that missing pieces and include it in your PLSP abstract. For infographic-based PLSPs that are more relevant for standalone PLSPs and supplemental PLSPs, use both abstract and manuscript as your source material right from the beginning. When it comes to how to structure this content, generally we have seen that the headings in a PLSP follow the IMRAD structure of introduction, methods, results, and discussion. However, this is not something that's required, and then the researchers have the flexibility to choose the format and the structure of the PLSP depending on the content that they want to present. And the actual heading wording can vary because of this reason. There can be certain special scenarios. For example, sometimes we see a single PLSP being written for multiple manuscripts. One such example is that we often see complex clinical trials happening, and there may be multiple manuscripts being generated for different parts of that trial. However, for the benefit of patients and the public, the PLSP provides a summary of all the different parts of that study in a single PLSP. So that's one example of special scenarios. When it comes to principles that govern the actual content, the health literacy and numeracy principles for the content are aligned with other plain language communication. In terms of reading level, we see generally 6th to 8th grade reading level is targeted. However, it can vary based on the content of the manuscript and the target audience that you are aiming for. It is absolutely beneficial to leverage any existing glossary for plain language or patient communication that you may have already existing within your organization. And we are seeing many sponsors taking active initiative of aligning their glossaries across different domains so that a consistent communication can be shared externally with patients and the public across different departments. Use a PLSP template to create standards for PLSP content for across different manuscripts, but we also recommend to leave room for flexibility because this is definitely something new, and as we gain more experience, we would be able to standardize the templates maybe more. However, that flexibility and using it as a guide so that we can take a pragmatic approach depending on the manuscript content is important. At the same time, you can set standards based on the type of research. For example, what level of information would be discussed in an interventional randomized clinical trial versus an observational study is something that can be aligned so that there isn't too much variation in the publications being produced. And again, an important point is to test these with your target audience to confirm the readability and effectiveness of this document. We also acknowledge that with advancement in technology, many generative AI tools are now available that can be used to create drafts of plain language summaries of publications under the supervision of human experts. This is something that can bring in efficiency, and I'm sure many organizations are at least considering it at this stage. So this is something that's important to be considered. I want to pause here and see with Vicky. So if you can share your insights as a target audience for PLSPs, what patients or public would be looking for in these documents?
Thanks, Biddy. I think when we say 6 to 8 grades, we think of it as a patient community as, putting it out there at the level of your 12-year-old cousin or your 12-year-old niece or nephew, that would they be able to read it? And when we went through, I suppose, Action Teams, the one thing I found was it was incredibly difficult, but the reviewers were tremendous and their support was tremendous in how they came back and explained, it is easier to understand grammar. Don't repeat yourself, personalize it for your reader. There's an importance on the glossary, but one thing that we actually found when we had actually put the glossary together, and this was Action Teams, so it was teenagers and caregivers and HCPs. One of the comments came back and it said, "Do not patronize the reader." And that was because we'd actually put in the glossary teenager, a person in the phase between childhood and adulthood. So these reviewers are really good in understanding that, hold on a second, that might be seen as being patronizing to the audience. Another one was HCP. I said, would it be much easier just to use doctor? This HCP is jargon, and I think it was more difficult than anything that I'd expected. But it was absolutely tremendous to see that the reviewers really, really understood what was needed by the audience.
These are some great examples and insights into your experiences. Thank you for sharing. And I absolutely agree with your first suggestion on thinking about whether your 12-year-old niece or nephew could understand, because often when we start thinking about plain language communication and we leave it as a broad patient or public audience, it's often very difficult to imagine who that audience is. And then using that hack of, identifying someone that meets that criteria and writing for that person can make it really easy to then flow. So these are some of our other best practices that we want to highlight. And I want to probably emphasize on the first one around using everyday plain language, something that I like to say, that use the language that you would use in your living room conversation. Outside of scientific community, that's the language that you want to be using, and identify a person and write for them. The second one that I really think is absolutely critical and important is to focus on why and so what rather than how. And if you do that, it allows you to include only the absolutely necessary information in the PLSP and leave out good to know additional information, because often as researchers, it becomes difficult to know when to stop when you have something so detailed to start with. So that's another important one. And the third one that I want to emphasize here is ensuring that your PLSP reflects the overall results and conclusion of the publication. It may seem obvious, but as Vicky also shared her experience, and I add mine as well, I think writing plain language is one of the most difficult task, because you need to think from all different angles and perspectives and make sure that while simplifying, you have not changed the meaning, the intent, not made it too generic. So there are so many different factors, and often this could be an observational observation that there is difference in the meaning given in the PLSP versus the publication. So those are the three that I want to highlight. I know some of these best practices are already are discussed in one of the newsletters that was published in ISMAP. And Stephanie, you were part of that publication that talked about Pfizer's approach for developing PLSPs. Do you want to share more insights on how you developed that approach and what's important at Pfizer?
Sure, Vidhi, thank you. I also want to add, just to kind of piggyback on your comment about kind of being consistent with the original publication, ensuring that the PLS reflects the results in the conclusion. But I think it's also important to mention that it may be helpful in the PLS when there's information in the manuscript that talks about a disease state, but it doesn't specifically describe the disease state in the manuscript. It may be helpful in the PLS to talk about that disease state a bit and give some kind of general information that might be helpful for the reader. That also being said, it may also be helpful to talk about the drug itself, mechanism of action in lay terms, and how that drug works, just to give some general background information for the audience, tends to be helpful as well. But at Pfizer, I'll talk a little bit about how we incorporate best practices. We actually developed a required form, it's called, which is part of our publication SOP here at Pfizer. So we formalized our process for PLS review and development. The required form, it's basically a summary of the scientific publication checklist that I mentioned earlier. And within this form, there are content development considerations. For example, the PLS itself must be factual and objective in its conveyance of data. And also it must be non-promotional. That's very important. And within the form, we also include a list of kind of do's and don'ts when you develop a PLS. Some examples are some of these that are listed on this slide, but also do use short words. We say that sentences less than 16 words are recommended, so shorter sentences. Also using active voice when you develop the PLS rather than a passive voice. Some highlights of the don'ts that are included in our required form are we don't want to use any acronyms that may be confusing or jargon. We want to avoid scientific information, including p-values and confidence intervals that would be very confusing to a lay reader. This document that we have also goes over our review and approval process that we have here. So it's kind of an all-encompassing document that describes how to develop and how we go about reviewing internally our PLS prior to submission.
Thank you for sharing that. And anyone who's in process of defining their PLSP strategy and approach, I highly recommend to look at that article. We have also mentioned the reference on the bottom of the slide. I also want to talk about a little bit about design, and then we want to show some actual examples of what good looks like in a PLSP and what are some good ways to show some data. So when it comes to design, the light background is something that's preferred, and definitely high contrast between background and text is important. Because these are written public facing, they are often use many different design elements, and one of the very important ones are using clear demarcation between different sections and using enough white space to allow your readers to digest information. Using simple and engaging visuals is absolutely an important element, because it can often help, if done right, often help to explain certain scientific concepts in a very easy and intuitive way. Font size is kept generally at least at 12 points, and avoiding italics, underlining, and all caps is something recommended. And of course, this is like a snapshot of different elements that are critical when it comes to health literacy of documents written for public. So do check out the newsletter that we have mentioned. Now let's look at some examples. The first example is around the structure of a standalone PLSP. In example one, you will see it starts with who is this article for, and then why the study was done, and follows an MRAD structure where we talk about methods and what happened during this study, followed by results in what were the main findings, and discussion and what do the results of the study mean. However, equally valid is example 2, which was taken from an actual PLSP, where right after why the study is being done, the writer has shared what were the overall results, followed by other background information in terms of which medicines were tested and people were included and how the analysis was done. So these, both of them are valid and can be considered based on what works best for your content. Next is an example of explaining a complex disease, in this case Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And this infographic has been used how this disease affects a person in different body parts, including the muscles, heart, lungs, and the bones. So very visual and very easy to follow the content. This is another example where baseline characteristics are discussed for 2 different arms in a clinical trial. And just by looking at the height and weight symbols, you immediately know what the baseline characteristics are and what's being measured, and something very neatly done in this example. Something similar is in another one, which shows example of study participants and treatment being given. So it starts with telling how many men and women joined this clinical study for people who had accidental urination. And then it showed how all of these participants were divided into 3 different treatment groups. And this one example is around results where the BMI and body weight data is being shown in teenagers. The drug and placebo arm are clearly shown in a graphical way, where there's a decrease in the BMI compared to placebo, where there's 1% increase, and with some introductory explanatory text given on the left, which has been color coded according to the drug and placebo colors. So very visual, very neatly done without using too many words. So these are some great examples of how information can be presented, which is understandable as well as engaging. Now let's switch gears again and talk about discoverability and dissemination. And I want to hand over to Joe to first talk about PLSP discoverability. I know so many people have already put in effort and created a PLSP out there, but who is reading it and how do we make sure it reaches our audience? So over to you, Joe.
Thanks, Vidhi. Yeah, so I think, with PLSPs, it's all well and good having your sort of strategy, process, etc. But I think ultimately what you really want to know is that PLSPs are going to be discovered and that the right audience is going to find that content. And what we really sort of see with PLSPs is the sort of a push and pull situation. You need to sort of push it out there in terms of publish it, that sort of thing. But you need to do the best that you can to make sure that they are discovered as well. So there's a number of ways that we can do this sort of through the different types of the PLSP. So, in the first instance, within so the PLS abstract, you know, they're usually available sort of open access alongside the manuscript, and they can be sort of discovered, you know, with the original manuscript. So, you know, if you sort of search, for instance, plain language summary by looking at content on PubMed, it can discover, it can find out that content. If you as well somehow use the word plain language summary within the abstract that you've written, hopefully on SEO by searching on Google, if you sort of search up, you know, sort of search plain language summary and obesity for something, it might then bring up those articles that do have the plain language summary. That's still a working process, but that's sort of a way around this as well. With the supplemental PLSP, these are just slightly more difficult to discover because they're usually sort of published within the supplementary data of a manuscript, and that sometimes is behind a paywall, so it's not always accessible. And there's usually not a signpost as well to say that a plain language summary is available within that supplementary data. You know, some journals just publish supplementary data for sort of a collection of content, and somewhere within there will be the plain language summary. So in those situations, what we would recommend is that you either have a clear signpost within the manuscript online saying, you know, here is the plain language summary, or mention it somewhere, perhaps within the abstract or somewhere on the article, sort of saying a plain language summary is available in X, Y, and Z, and link to it. So that's the sort of, you know, the obvious, or perhaps not so obvious way to find the supplementary PLSPs as well. And as Stephanie mentioned as well, with those supplementary PLSPs, there's always the option to share those on a Figshare channel. Maybe the publisher might have their own Figshare portal, or the sponsor as well might have a Figshare portal where those can be published on as well. So with the standalone PLSPs as well, so these are slightly more discoverable because they are articles in their own right, and you know, journals do publish articles to help make them discoverable as such. So in the first instance, we recommend the words plain language summary are used in the title. It makes it really clear from the outset that the article is a plain language summary, and then it helps with that sort of SEO discoverability as well. There's also publishers, you know, send sort of metadata to PubMed to make sure that articles are all indexed correctly on PubMed, and you can use a specific sort of meta tag to help identify plain language summaries so that they can then be sort of indexed as such on PubMed, so you can find that content. And also, you know, another sort of unique feature of those standalone PLSPs is because they have that sort of functionality as a standalone article, they do then have their own metrics, so they can then also be shared on social media, that sort of thing as well.
Can I just add to that just quickly, Joe? That was a great overview of discoverability. The importance of including the PubMed tagging and the meta tag on PubMed. So it's helpful to remind whoever's publishing, you know, the publisher, that they should be ensuring the correct PLS PubMed tagging, which there is a plain language summary meta tag in the other abstract field under PubMed. So it might be helpful to just when submitting to your publisher or journal, just ensure that that's being done, because that's going to enhance discoverability. Because there was a poster at ISMAP that did some research on meta tagging for PLS, and there's a whole lot of PLS out there that have not been meta tagged correctly. So definitely need to increase that in order to increase discoverability.
And then when it comes to dissemination, I'm really keen to hear everyone's thoughts here in terms of some of the best practices involved in dissemination. So, Stephanie, if you want to go first.
Yeah, I mean, first, and we want to always ensure that PLS are published open access. There's no reason to publish a PLS if it's not freely available. We want to ensure that it's discoverable for all audiences, and that starts with ensuring that it's open access. But we often work with patient advocacy groups here at Pfizer, who often use the PLS to disseminate to their audience as well. That's kind of beyond what we do as the sponsor, but it's always good that they're aware of what we have published and what is freely available. So just raising the awareness that way. And some journals do kind of share the PLS on their own sites, and they're free to do that. So that's always a helpful way of dissemination. Not sure if Joe or Vicky has more to add there for dissemination.
Yeah, I'll just be happy to sort of, add in from a sort of journal side, when we do sort of publish the standalone PLSPs, as part of that sort of standard sort of post-publication process as such, we do reach out to sort of relevant patient advocacy groups that in that sort of disease area or sort of focus area, and we do let them know of the availability of the PLSP. I mean, PLSPs are standard, as Stephanie mentioned, are published open access. That's just it's not an option that people can take. We mandate that they are published open access. And as such, when we reach out to these sort of patient advocacy groups, we sort of let them know that it's available. And we've seen just from various PLS that we've published as well, that, some of them sort of share them in newsletters to their members. They might sort of write a blog post about them. We've seen people sort of having a big discussion on X, Twitter, whatever it's called now, sort of discussing the article. So I think that's a good way to sort of, make sure that that content is disseminated out there and that it then can be discovered as well. And as I mentioned as well, as part of that sort of standard process, we do share these articles on social media. On Twitter mainly, for that's the patient groups, but also on Facebook as well. So there's various different sort of platforms that these can be shared and disseminated to as well.
Yeah, and I think just from the patient perspective, one thing that we do is all of our materials go out at that 12-year-old reading level. So we try to ensure that, everything is at that level, that it's visual. And when it comes to dissemination, we have many patients and those who are the average person at home who pick up our materials. So the patient advocacy groups are really, really important for your dissemination.
Absolutely, and thanks so much for sharing your thoughts on discoverability and dissemination. Hopefully, today's session helped gain more insight on best practices involved in writing and disseminating plain language summaries of publications. They are an extremely important document that can help build public trust and foster diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And it's important that to start planning it early on in the planning process for your publications, starting with the pilot and reflecting on the lessons learned before implementing it fully, and creating guidance for consistency with broader patient communication. I want to first thank all the speakers here for sharing your experiences, your insights, and your suggestions with our audience today. And want to take last 5 minutes to take some audience questions. Thank you so much to all of you who are attending today's session and sharing your questions. Really appreciate it. And we have got some great questions here. The first one, and I'll direct this one to Joe. GPP 2022 encourages manuscripts to have a PLS. Does this mean that any 3 options would be valid? The abstract, supplemental, or standalone?
Yes, as far as I interpret the guidelines, it does. I mean, I think in the first instance, having the option to publish the plain language summary with the original manuscript is always preferred, because the two are then sort of, people can discover that alongside the original manuscript. But where that's not possible, I think having the sort of standalone, sort of separate PLSP is another option as well. I just think as long as there's some form of plain language summary of a manuscript available, then that will fulfill that criteria, definitely.
Thank you. And the second question, I want to ask you this one as well. So in regard to standalone PLSPs, are these published after the more traditional manuscript or instead of?
It's after. Yeah, they have to reference. They have to be a plain language summary of an original publication. So they have to, because if the plain language summary became before the original manuscript, then the plain language summary would be the original manuscript. Oh, it would get so complicated. So I think that, yes, you have to have your original manuscript. And it could be that your original manuscript was, published 1 or 2, 3, 4 years ago, and now you want to do a standalone PLSP. There's no sort of, it has to be within 6 months of publication. And, and some journals as well, unfortunately, have an embargo period as well, where they don't allow any acceptable secondary publications, which PLSPs are, after a certain, maybe a year or so. So I think that you have to then you can sort of look back on your publications that you've done 2 or 3 years ago and think, well, actually, because there's a need, maybe we should do a standalone PLSP now. So yeah, I hope that answers that question.
Can I just add to that? I actually think that's a really valid point, because there is so many abstracts, so much content out there that hasn't been developed into a PLS. So I think it's a really important point that you bring up, Jo. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing. The next question is on, although journals have instructions, are there any generic templates or guidelines to help develop PLSP for the first time? And I know situation is very different now compared to a couple of years ago. I think a lot of guidance is available now for PLSPs, including from Envision Group, or even FSG website has a lot of guidance on creating these. Stephanie, I'm interested to hear your opinion as well, how Pfizer decided to create the content. Were there any templates or guidelines that you were referring to?
We actually, when we developed our guidance, we worked with experts in health literacy to develop the guidance. But there's, to your point, there's lots of information out there on publishers' websites for development of PLSPs, including Envision, I think, has a wonderful toolkit that you can access. Also, for FSG, they do have a recommended template to use for development of PLS. So that's also a good resource just to get kind of the format down, especially if you're planning on submitting to FSG, or you just want to take a look at kind of an example of a template or format. They do have that available as well.
Great. Thank you. Thanks so much for sharing, and hope that was helpful for the audience. And thank you so much for attending today's webinar and listening and sharing your thoughts as well. We'll end today's webinar here, and we hope that you get to fill that feedback form that will pop on your screen. So thank you, and hope you have a great rest of your day and evening. Bye.